Okay, in terms of the stuff, welcome to the second episode of PHI 1100, Critical Inquiry. If you were here, just sign in. If you weren't here last time, especially important to sign in so I can go and put you as attending. If you've added the class since this was printed, just put your name down at the bottom, and then I'll go on my Rattler, put you down as attending, and then next week I'll print up the new roster once after all these end. Otherwise, I just keep printing up rosters and okay, the deadlines remain unchangified. So, quiz and assignments part 1, deadline February 1st, 11 to 9 to 9 p.m. And again, with the quizzes, they're on a 5-minute timer once you fire them up, so be sure to complete them once you start them. The assignments are on the calendar, so once you can open them up, work on them, leave them, go back, up until February 1st. So just if you do an assignment, just be sure you finish it by then and submit it by then. And they don't auto-submit, so if you leave it unsubmitted, it'll just sit there. Exam 1, quiz assignments part 2, March 1st. Exams again are on a 1-hour timer. If you start one up, it keeps on ticking even if you go away from it. So, as a bit of advice, don't start one unless you got the time to complete it. Exam 2, quiz assignments part 3, April 5th. And then exam 3 for quizzes and assignments part 4, April 26th. And then exam 5, the final covering all the things, deadlines Wednesday, May 1st. And this deadline's at 5 instead of the usual midnight because it's the final. And this is 100 questions, 2 hours, standard exams, 50 questions, 1 hour. Before pressing on to the new stuff, any stuff about the stuff that has been or the stuff that shall be that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we were looking at kind of the heart, the soul, the spine, the center, the foundation, whatever metaphor you'd like, of critical thinking in particular and philosophy in general. And that is, of course, the argument. An argument in philosophy consists of claims, which are statements that are either true or false, and they occupy one of two particular roles. To use an analogy to sports, if you have a bunch of people out on the field just kind of throwing a ball around, it's just people on the field throwing a ball around. But if you organize them into teams, and you have like a first baseman, a catcher, a pitcher, a batter, etc., then you get a baseball game. Same with arguments. If you just have a bunch of claims, they're just claims. But if you put them into roles or positions, it can become an argument. And the roles or positions for arguments are, first, the premise, or premises, and kind of like breadsticks at Olive Garden, they're theoretically unlimited. You can have as many premises as you wish. And they provide the evidence or reasons for the other thing, the conclusion. And the conclusion is the point you're trying to make, what you're trying to prove, and you get one and only one of these. So every argument's got at least one premise, up to infinity, and one and only one conclusion. To find these, when you're looking for them, you would ask, for the conclusion, the question, what is the point? Not in the sense of, why am I doing this, but in the sense of, what is this person trying to prove or establish? Once you find that, then you might have an argument. What you need to look for then are the premises, or premise. And you ask the question, what reason or evidence is being offered to support that point? If the answer is nothing, you haven't got an argument. If the answer is something, even if it's awful, terrible, bad, you'd still have an argument. So a person could have a point, but no argument. So a person might say, the shutdown is terrible. That's a point, but they have no argument. If they say the shutdown is terrible, therefore, it should be stopped, they would have a really basic argument. Conclusion, it should be stopped. Reason, premises, because it's terrible. Not a great argument, but still an argument. Now, arguments come in all sorts of varieties. There's simple ones, big ones, short ones, confusing ones, terrible ones, good ones, religious ones, metaphysical ones, chemical ones, etc. Infinite number in theory. Now, once you get an argument, you'll want to assess it to see if it's good or bad. To use an analogy, it's kind of like, well, to use an analogy to mining, you know, they dig up like ore, gold ore or something, or gold, you know, stuff. You'd want to assess what's the value of it. Or if you are someone who's, you know, purchasing for a business or a company, and you're buying various things, be it grain or meat or milk or whatever, you'd want to assess the value. Is this good stuff to buy or lousy stuff? So how do you tell whether you should buy an argument or not, logically speaking? Well, fortunately, it's pretty simple. There are really only two questions to ask. But of course, as with many simple things, there's a lot more complexity behind it. But here are the two questions. Question one. Are the premises true or not? That's a question of the quality of the evidence. Is what I'm being given as support, is it actually true or is it untrue? Is it, you know, lies? Secondly, there's a matter of the logic, how well it's put together. So the second question is, do the premises logically support the conclusion? Now, to use a couple metaphors to illustrate this, we can think of it kind of in the following metaphorical way. Assessing arguments is a lot like assessing cooking. Broadly speaking, there's two ways cooking can go wrong. Now, of course, there are many, many ways, you know, if you're getting very specific about it, how it can go wrong, you know, like kitchen fires, etc. But in general, there's two main concerns when you're cooking the stuff. First thing is this. If you're going to have a good meal, you got to have good ingredients. If you have lousy ingredients, the meal is going to be limited by that. No matter how well you put it together, if all you have to work with is, say, some dirt, twigs, a slug, and some, you know, mud puddle water, no matter how you combine slugs and mud puddles, you're not going to get a delicious feast, most likely. But if you have really good ingredients, you know, fresh vegetables, you know, fine spices, etc., you can potentially make a good meal because you've got good groceries, ingredients to work with. So it's kind of like with a meal, what you've got, you know, in your fridge and cupboards, what kind of ingredients do you have? What do you got to work with? If it's terrible, then it's probably going to be bad. If it's good ingredients, you could put it together well. But of course, there's more to cooking than just having good ingredients. You know, if someone goes, anybody with money can go and buy really good ingredients. But not everybody is going to be a good cook, which takes us to our second part. Namely, in the case of cooking, the cooking part. How well is it put together? So cooking a meal is more than just throwing in good ingredients. It's how they're assembled, how they're put together. To continue the metaphor, if we're going to make a cake, there are good and bad ways of putting together a cake, even if you have the same ingredients. For example, suppose I get a bag of flour, some eggs, some milk, some sugar, and I take the bag of flour and I just toss it in the pan. Don't open it, just throw it in the pan. And then I take the carton of milk, toss that in the pan too, toss a couple eggs in there, and then I stick it in the oven at 500 degrees for, let's say, 7 hours. What I'll probably get there is probably a kitchen fire. Even though all the ingredients are good, you know, good flour, good milk, good eggs, etc., I put it together terribly, really terribly. Now, if I put it together properly, you know, mix the flour, the eggs, etc., cook it at the right temperature, then I'll get good cake instead of kitchen fire. And so with that metaphor, that illustrates how arguments work. There are the ingredients. Are they good or bad? In the case of premises, true or false. And then there's how it's put together, how it's assembled. In the case of cooking, was the recipe followed? Was it put together properly, cooked at the proper temperature, proper time, or not? And again, just like with cooking, you can have either of these be bad, either be good, or a mix. So a good argument is like good cake. You gotta have good ingredients, put together well. And then of course there's two ways it can go bad. Lousy ingredients and badly put together. Another metaphor would be, say, building stuff, like buildings, or furniture, or clothing. There's, again, two ways clothing or anything you build can go good or bad. One would be the stuff that it's made out of. So if someone's trying to build a desk and all they have is rotted plywood and bent nails, then no matter how well they put it together, they're still going to have a desk made of rotten plywood and rusty bent nails. It's not going to be that good. Likewise, if someone is making clothing and all they have is tattered, crappy cloth, like burlap sacks, no matter how well they put together that burlap, it's still going to be burlap. And of course, the second part is how well it's put together. How well the table or building or clothing is assembled. And so there's what's it made of, good or bad, and there's how you build it, good or bad. Now this is an important distinction in logic because when we're assessing arguments, these are quite different. And the reason why I make that emphasis is because people often kind of smush them together and just treat them as the same, even though they're very different. This is about truth. Are the claims true or not? This is about the logic. Do they actually fit together logically or not? And as we'll see, one thing that's kind of confusing is you can have stuff where the logic is perfect, but everything in it is untrue. You can have stuff where the logic is terrible, but everything is true. And of course, other combinations. Do you have two quick examples? Everything I say will be true. This is a jacket. This is a backpack. Therefore, today is Tuesday. All that I've spoken is true. Yet, of course, there's no logical connection. So I've said true things, but there's no argument there. Now, I can also say things that are not true, but are good logic. For example, if Bill is a unicorn, then Bill is a horn. Premise 2, Bill is a unicorn. Conclusion, Bill is a horn. Now, of course, the logic is good, but the information there is not true, because sadly there are no unicorns. They smoked, they died. Important life lesson. Don't smoke or you'll be as dead as a unicorn. So we can have good logic, lousy information. And we'll see this throughout the course of the course. Now with arguments, they get all kinds of stuff, as we saw going on. Some things about them are, as we'll see in the future in a bit, we can have arguments in which they're extended, and we can have arguments, things that look like arguments but are not, and we can have things that don't look like arguments but are. We'll see more of this in the future. So at this point, the critical things you should know would be these. What's an argument? What's a premise? What's a conclusion? Anything about that? Okay, anything about that needs more stuff. Okay, now we turn to cognitive biases. Now these are important in a couple ways. One, on the side of good, these are important to know for two reasons. One is being aware of other people's cognitive biases, which from a moral standpoint or a practical standpoint will help you understand other people. Because it may seem that they're like bad or evil or stupid, and they may not be. They could just be victims of their own cognitive biases. Secondly, of course, in our own case, we want to be aware that we all suffer from these, and so when we're trying to reason well and make good decisions, then we want to be aware of how our thinking process is also distorted, damaged by these biases. So on the side of good, it's a way to know about these, to know why people do what they do. They need not be evil or stupid. They could just be subject to their cognitive biases. And in our own case, we want to know about our own, weaknesses, so that way we can compensate them. To use a sporting analogy, if you have like a knee injury, a weak knee, and you're trying to run or play tennis or something, you want to know about that, so you don't, cripple yourself trying to overwork your knee, and so you want to know your weak points to compensate, so you don't, make mistakes and get hurt. Now, on the side of evil, cognitive biases can be exploited, because if you know people's weaknesses, we all have these, it's possible to exploit them, as we'll see with rhetoric and fallacies, in order to get people to behave stupidly or evilly. And people who want people to be stupid and evil, they know how to use these, and the more effective they are using them, the more they can get people to do stupid things and evil things. And the more you know about them on the defensive side, the more you can avoid being manipulated. Now, so what are these biases? Well, a bias, in this case, it's a defect in our cognition that leads us to accept or reject things, not based on good reasons, but simply based on this defect. To use an analogy, everyone's probably heard the phrase, seeing the world through rose-colored glasses. The idea being that someone sees the world as better than it is. And of course, people can have a negative look too, seeing the world through, I guess, like, I don't know, sadness-colored lenses or something. Although sadness is not a color, probably not. And so the idea is that when we're looking at the world, this distorts our view. So we don't see things as they are, we say things in a distorted way. And if we get a distorted information in, we're not going to reason well. So what are some of these common biases? Well, the first one is this: belief bias. Now, one thing that people do is, when they believe the conclusion of an argument, and it may be true, they'll tend to say the argument is therefore good, because the conclusion is something they believe, and it may even be true. To give a concrete example, when people are arguing about things that are very sort of emotionally loaded, like politics and religion, people tend to assess reasoning based not on reasoning, but based on how they feel about the point being made. So if someone is, suppose you have someone who's a die-hard atheist, they would tend to think any argument that concludes there is no God is a good argument, even if it's terrible, because they like the conclusion. Likewise, someone who's a die-hard believer would tend to accept any argument that says God exists, because they like that conclusion. But of course, there can be terrible arguments for God and terrible arguments against God. What a person believes about the conclusion has nothing to do with the quality of the logic. So when we're assessing argumentation, we have to be careful to consider that to ask, am I accepting the logic of this argument because the logic is good, or am I just buying it because I think the conclusion is true? And again, an argument could be terrible logically, but still everything in it could be true. As we'll see, there are two separate things. Now, the defense against this is to ask yourself, okay, I really like this conclusion, but is the logic actually good? Does it stand up to scrutiny? Now, the way to use it against other people, of course, is if you have a lousy argument, is find something they want to believe and just use, a crappy argument. And people will tend to believe it, even if the reasoning is terrible. Secondly, availability heuristic, which is kind of a fancy term for a pretty basic thing. Here's the idea. A heuristic is simply a fancy term essentially for how we estimate probabilities and likelihoods of things happening. And it's something we do every day. To use a simple example, when you're at the crosswalk looking at traffic, you are thinking probably subconsciously or perhaps consciously about the likelihood that the cars will stop and not hit you. And some people have a lot of confidence that they'll step right out even though the traffic's not even slowing down. And sometimes they don't make it. Other people, their view is it's less likely, so they'll wait. Now, people are generally terrible at probability. And people also think they're really good at it, even though they're really terrible, which leads to all kinds of problems. Now, one way in which people are generally terrible at it is this cognitive bias, which is this. Availability heuristic means this. It is when, to use kind of technical terms, it's when we estimate the probability that something will occur based on how often we hear about it, as opposed to the actual probability, the actual occurrence. So what we do is we would say, kind of subconsciously, this is likely because I've heard it talked about a lot, as opposed to this is likely because it happens a lot. Now, reasoning this way, this happens a lot, therefore it's likely to happen, that's pretty good logic. Because if something does in fact happen a lot, then it's probably going to happen. But if someone says, I've heard about this a lot, therefore it's probably going to happen, not good logic. Why? Well, because hearing about something a lot is different from something happening a lot. Now, psychologically, we probably do this because we think if I'm hearing about it a lot, that means it's going to be happening a lot. But need not be the case. Now, to give a concrete illustration, take, for example, well, let's take terrorism. Now, do people talk about terrorism a lot? Like when a terrorist attack occurs, how long does it stay in the news? Yeah, weeks, until the next thing happens. And it gets repeated constantly. Like if you have a terrorist attack or a mass shooting, it'll get in the news, you hear it every time the news comes around, and it'll hang in there for a couple of weeks until something new comes in. And so what happens is, psychologically, when people hear about a terrorist attack or a mass shooting or a shark attack, people will get worried. They'll think, I'm going to be killed by a terrorist attack, or I'm going to be attacked by a shark, or I'm going to be killed in a mass shooting. But of course, the probability, I mean, it's not zero, but the probability is really low. But psychologically, people go by how much they hear it. So if people hear in the news about something bad that's really uncommon, they really overestimate the probability. People are more likely to be killed by donkeys than by sharks. You can check the stats. More people are killed by donkeys every year than sharks. And donkeys kill more people than terrorists. So they're super dangerous. Super dangerous indeed. They are dangerous animals. Well, relatively speaking. Mosquitoes are actually the deadliest animal. They kill more people than anything. I don't mean like, giant mosquitoes attacking people. Because all the, stuff they carry. Now, on the side of good, how do you beat the availability heuristic? Well, basically it involves doing math and knowing the actual probabilities. And so the way to defeat it is to say, well, okay, I'm hearing about this thing, Trump's talking about people from MS-13 coming and killing Americans. What is the actual probability of me being killed by someone in MS-13? And then look at the actual stats. And so the defense is knowing the numbers and doing the math. Now, of course, psychologically, this may not work, even if you know what this is. To illustrate my own case, I'm terrified of heights and flying. And even though I know, statistically speaking, the safest place I'll ever be in my life will be on a commercial airplane. Because everyone on the plane has been, searched. We're up in the sky in a metal tube, and the pilots are professionals, and there's a vast network dedicated to getting me from one place to another without me dying. And statistically speaking, that's the safest I'll, as a private citizen, that's the safest I'll ever be. When I'm driving to the airport, there's a good chance, not a good chance, but I'm much more likely to be killed. Getting in the shower, I'm much more likely to be killed because I could slip and fall and have a shower death. How embarrassing. Yet psychologically, I'm still terrified of flying, even though I know I'm sitting there on the plane I'm incredibly safe. This is the safest I'll ever be. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And so it is hard to beat. And so what you kind of have to do is part of a general thing in thinking well, is learning how to separate how we feel about stuff from the actual probability, which can be tough. I mean, when I go on the plane, I'm just I'm sitting there and the person's like, oh, you seem really calm. I'm like, I am terrified. I am super terrified. Why are you so calm? It's because I teach critical thinking. So got to work through it. Plus all the vodka. That helped a lot too. On the side of evil, though, this can be quite useful. How so? Well, let's take an example of Trump. How often does Trump repeat about all the bad stuff that's going to happen to us? When he gives a speech, how many bad things come up in that speech? Yeah, law. It's like MS-13 is going to kill you. Mexican's going to come and kill you and take your job and kill you some more, take your job some more, take your killing job. And I don't know if Trump does this consciously or unconsciously, but he is playing into availability heuristic. Because the more you hear something, the more it seems true. So people will say things that are, and they'll believe things that are entirely untrue, just because they hear it so much. Which is why also they send people on the talk shows out, they'll send out their surrogates to say the same points. Because if you hear it on all these different shows, and even if you initially don't believe it, if you hear it enough, it'll start affecting you. So one reason why people who support the president believe what he says, in part, is because of this. They hear it so much, it feels true. And now we're all victims of this. We all do this. But again, the defense is, unfortunately, math, knowing the probability. But again, psychologically, it can still be tough. Like I said, I'm terrified of flying. I'm afraid of sharks. Even though I know the probability of being attacked by one is incredibly low. You're more likely to be killed driving to the beach or in the restroom at the beach than to be attacked by a shark. But still, people are afraid of sharks. Before moving on, anything about these that needs more stuff? Now, one interesting feature of many biases is that in some cases, they kind of contradict each other. They lead us to think one way, but also the exact opposite way, which is kind of weird, but people can do that. We can believe things that are contradictory somehow, even those we'll see, logically impossible. False consensus effect. Now, one thing about people is, as we'll see in a bit, people think their own group is better than the other group, but at the same time, they also believe that everyone thinks like them. So you have this sort of weird double view. Anyone who's not in my group is terrible, yet everyone thinks basically alike. So what does this mean? Well, the idea is that psychologically, people tend to think that other people, except I guess their enemies, agree with them about positions on issues, about liking or disliking movies, food, etc. Now, what can be some practical effects of this? Well, one effect, of course, is just on kind of the social level, where people will think that other people like, say, the same movies, books, music, and TV shows as they do. Now, if we really think about it, we know on one hand, not everybody likes the same stuff, same books, movies, TV shows. But of course, people also tend to think people do. So one thing, is a practical example, if you're ever planning like an event, something like the food that you serve. If people are, when you think, okay, what food should we have, it's natural for someone to think, well, I like this. Surely everyone likes this. But of course, they may not. It's especially true in the case of food when you bring into the fact that some people are vegetarians and vegans. So when people are planning, I have friends who are vegans and vegetarians, and when they go to places, I'll eat anything. So I know I'm wrong to do it, but yeah, I still do it because I'm terrible. But for people who are vegans and vegetarians, going to many places, they often have like no options. They even put like meat in the salad. I sometimes think they put like meat in the water. It's like baking water. And so if someone's not a vegetarian or vegan, it probably doesn't even occur to them that there are, they probably know there are such people, but when they're planning the food, they'll think, okay, I'll just throw a salad on there, they'll be fine. But of course, from the standpoint of a vegan or vegetarian, just having like a salad, and everyone else is getting, lasagna and, desserts and all kinds of other stuff, they probably don't feel too good about that. And so as a concrete example, when people think that everyone else thinks the way they do, one example is just something as simple as getting the food for an event. If someone doesn't think, oh yeah, there are some people who think it's wrong to eat the corpses of murdered animals, exaggerate a bit, and to not take them into account would be to leave them out. Now, of course, someone could say, oh yeah, the people don't like me, but screw those guys or gals. But if they're just leaving them out because they don't think about it, they'd be falling victim to this. Now, of course, it also occurs in politics and ethics. People often sincerely think everyone agrees with their view of morality, like their view of who should be allowed to marry, or whether people should use marijuana or not, or views about any issue. So, how do we defend against this? Well, an easy way to do it is just ask that question. Does everyone, I think this, or I like this, but does everyone? And so, to use a very practical example, if you're in charge of planning, say, the food for an event, ask yourself, I'm fine with eating everything, but are there people who may not want to eat just all ham? Might they want something that's like not meat and have like a main dish? Or put together like a playlist of music. I like all this, but does everyone like this? So maybe I should put some other stuff in there, so it's not just what I want. Also in politics, if someone or in ethics to say, I believe this about politics or economics or ethics, but does everyone believe this? Now, on the side of evil, this can, of course, be useful, because if everyone thinks everyone else agrees, and you can make them kind of feel that way, they won't believe there's going to be any opposition or any reason to change. That everything is fine, because everyone thinks the way I do. Bandwagon. Now, back in the ancient days, before the YouTubes, and even before television or radio, there were, unfortunately, politicians. And so a good question would be, how did politicians before, the internet and radio and TV, how did they do their thing? Well, obviously in print, in some cases, but also what they do, and same with advertising for other stuff, they would use a literal bandwagon, which is exactly what it sounds like. A wagon with a band on it. And they'd roll in through town, and they'd play, the music to attract people's attention, and they would, have banners advertising a politician or a product. Now, there soon arose from this the phrase, jumping on the bandwagon. And to jump on the bandwagon is to join with a side, not because it's correct or good or right, but because it's winning. And psychologically, people, well, I guess I'll put it as a question. Do people want to be losers? Do people say, like, I want to be a loser? What's your objective in life? Loser. Or do people want to be winners? Yeah, winners. And people don't want to associate with losers. They want to associate with winners. So the bandwagon effect psychologically is this. People will tend to view whatever side, position, person is winning as being correct, good, or right, because they're winning. Now, if all there is to being correct or good or right is winning, then yeah, that works. But as we know, terrible ideas, terrible people, terrible plans can't win. Otherwise, everything would be great, because if only the good and best won, everything would be really good. Unfortunately, we know that bad ideas can win, bad people can win. But psychologically, people want to hop on the bandwagon. They'll think, okay, this is winning. Well, they won't really do it consciously, but subconsciously they'll essentially be saying to themselves, well, they're winning, so I guess they're right. Or this side is winning, so it's correct. Now, in some cases, people do this consciously and cynically. For example, going back to the ancient days of 2016, when it looked like Trump was not going to win, what were most Republicans saying about Trump? Were they saying these? Yeah, that he's a joke, he's a buffoon, he's never going to win. And they dismissed it. And then these same people, what are they saying now?
He's a leader of the nation.
Yeah, he's great, he's a leader. I mean, think of like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham was saying all kinds of bad things about Trump before Trump was president, and now constantly tweets about what a great leader Trump is. Now, in that case, it's probably, purely cynical. Because in politics, you don't want to be on the losing side. And so, initially Trump was seen as a fool, a buffoon, etc. But then when he won, people wanted to practically be on his side. So they consciously kind of jumped on that bandwagon. Now here we have to distinguish between two types of reasons. One type of reason, and we'll see this in the future, is an actual logical reason. And an actual logical reason is the claim serves as evidence that something is true. Now, there are also what are called practical or prudential reasons to accept something. Namely that a person would say, well, this doesn't give me a logical reason to accept it as true, but I have a practical, pragmatic reason to go along. So, for example, the fact that Trump won doesn't prove that he's great or good. But when someone is in a position of power, people do have a practical, pragmatic reason to agree with it. I mean, for example, to be bipartisan, there are a lot of people who really hated Hillary Clinton. Friends of mine who, not as Republicans, a friend of mine who are hardcore Democrats, and they still hate Hillary Clinton. You say Hillary Clinton, and they're just like, and they start going mad. So I never say that in front of them because I don't want to trigger them. And if Hillary had won, maybe they would have come around. They would have, been cursing her, but if she won, they might have said, oh yeah, she's good. And so people can do that, across party lines. But the defense against it is to say, well, I have good reason to believe this is terrible. They won, but do I have any good reasons to believe now that anything has changed? If the answer is no, logically there's no reason. But again, pragmatically, people can say, well, if I'm opposing the winner, I'm going to be out. I'm not going to get the benefits. So they can pragmatically say they now have a reason to go along to get stuff. So we have to separate reasons to believe something is true, which is logic, and reasons to kind of just go along, which is pragmatic. Before going negative, anything about the bandwagon that needs more band or wagon? Negativity bias. Oh, the way to use the bandwagon effect. Win, basically. If you want people to be on your side, easy way to do it is win stuff. And interestingly, psychologically, the more you start winning, the more you'll win. Give a concrete example. Initially, of course, in politics, if you follow presidential politics at all, there'll be like a huge field. I assume all Democrats are going to try for president in 2020. There's already a bunch of people, saying they're going to run. And the way, of course, what happens is they'll kind of jump around the lead, etc. But once a person starts getting out front, then at a certain point they'll just start keeping that lead, because then people will start backing them. They get more money, they get more support, and then people will say, "Oh, look, they've got a lot of support. They're winning. I'm going to back them," and it becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, not surprisingly, the way to win is win. The defense against this is to say to yourself, okay, they're winning, or this idea is winning, but is it a good one? Is this person a good candidate? Is this a good idea? Do I have any reason logically to believe that, or are they just winning? Negativity bias. One interesting thing about us is that we weigh negative information much more than we weigh positive information. Now, when engaged in reasoning, one common thing we do when we're reasoning, and we'll see this in the future, is basically balancing evidence. We think of this, to give a sort of a specific name to it, it's essentially like a cost-benefit analysis. We look at the pluses and the minuses, and we weigh them. And then what we do typically, good decision-making would be, well, here are the pluses, here are the minuses. If there's more pluses than minuses, then go with that. And that's something we do with just about everything. For example, in purchasing stuff. If you're looking for a new phone, like if your phone is getting old and sad, when you're deciding which one to buy, you look at pluses, like storage space, speed, camera, etc. And you look at the minuses, like cost, and so on. And then you get the one that had the most plus and the least minuses. It's also used in ethics. If you take the course in ethics, you'll see this theory called Utilitarianism, where you do good and evil this way. If it creates more good than evil, it's good. More evil than good, bad. Now, when doing that, one of the major factors is how much do you weigh the pluses and minuses? So you could have two people agreeing, why yes, if there's more plus than minus, we should go with the plus. But people can disagree quite a bit about what is a plus and what's a minus and how they weigh against each other. So one person's feature may be a problem for someone else. For example, if something, say, increases the taxes on the wealthy to provide more to less wealthy people, well, from some people's standpoint, that would be terrible. Other people's standpoint, that would be good. So one person's plus and another person's minus. There's also the problem of weighing stuff. So if you have a negative factor versus a positive factor, which weighs more? For example, you can take something as simple as buying a phone. If you're weighing, say, cost against features, different people weigh them differently. Or more serious issue, like with economic growth and environmental pollution. To some people, the growth outweighs the pollution. Other people, pollution outweighs the growth. So how does this bias fit in there, and what is it? Well, here's the definition. Negativity bias, as I alluded to, is that we weigh the negative more than the positive. And of course, this falls into the general sort of overall complexity that people weigh things differently to begin with and see things differently. But laying that all aside, if we see something that's a negative, we tend to give it more weight than a positive. We overweigh the negative. Why is that? Well, depends on who you ask. Evolutionary theorists, their claim is, of course, that by being more focused on the negative, we're less likely to die. So we won't get as good stuff, but we'll avoid like more bad stuff, so we're less likely to die, so we keep on reproducing. That's kind of their explanation. But whatever the reason is, this seems pretty well established. We weigh the negative more than the positive. So how does this affect us? Well, a really good example of this would be in politics. We just had an election cycle, midterms come up, and we have the 2020 election coming up really soon. And what, of course, we see a lot of are negative ads. And the reason why they use negative ads is because they work. Same reason why people use, hammers and bulldozers. That stuff works pretty well. And so, if someone promises hope and change, and someone else offers fear and loathing often win. Because positive things get weighed less. It's not to say that people, don't weigh them at all, but negative stuff is weighed more. So, the reason why politicians use negative ads is because the minions or the companies they hire, they are aware of this. They know this stuff. They know that if a candidate's saying positive stuff, yeah, that's good, you gotta say some of that stuff, but it's the negative stuff that does the most damage. So we weigh the negative more than the positive. Now this also occurs in everyday life, in our interactions with other people. If you do good for somebody, how soon do they forget the good you have done them? Quickly, very quickly. Which is why we have the classic saying, What have you done for me lately? So people forget about the positive stuff. But if you wrong someone, how long do they remember that? Forever. They do not let that go. If you wrong someone in first grade, they still remember it. If they haven't balanced the books, they're waiting to balance the books. So watch out. Watch out for, Susie. She still remembers that. She's going to get you. Yes, the negative stuff really sticks. We remember it and we weigh it along. So you could do 1,000 good things, and you do one thing that's bad, that's what people remember. Which is terrible, but that's us. So, on the side of good, how do we deal with this? Well, we can't fully control how we feel about stuff, but we can try to balance it out. If we're aware that we weigh the negative more than the positive, we can try to be more objective. To say, okay, if we're looking at campaign ads, and they're saying terrible things about a person, first thing to say is, well, is it true? And then the thing to say is, well, if this is true, does it outweigh the actual good qualities? In trying to neutralize the negativity. Same with on a personal level. Like if we feel really angry because someone has wronged us somehow, we should sort of try to push that aside and say, okay, I feel really upset about this thing this person's done, but are they in general positive? Have they done me more good than bad? Now what we're going to feel, of course, is we're going to feel the bad and not feel the good, but if we want to be fair and just, we'd want to be honest and say, okay, this negative thing, I'm really going to weigh that heavily, but can I kind of push that aside to look at them more honestly when assessing friends? And everyone's seen this happen. You have people who are friends, a person's done all kinds of good things with somebody, they do one maybe not very serious bad thing, and then boom, the friendship just blows up over something that's pretty small, which can seem kind of stupid. Now this is not to say that there aren't really bad things that justify that, but we do weigh the negative too heavily. And so what we kind of have to do is, if we're aware we're putting our thumbs on the scales, we have to try to kind of pull them off and try to be more balanced about it. Now on the side of evil, this is incredibly useful, because if you want to manipulate people, going positive, you can do that. But the best way is going negative, because people weigh that much more. Because if you can prey on negative emotions, fear, anger, those are very powerful. And you can get people to do all kinds of stupid and evil stuff just by pushing them, because they're already leaning that way anyways. So the side of good, try to, push away the negativity. On the side of evil, be aware that's very powerful. That's what really sways people. And again, when the 2020 election comes up, we'll be seeing lots of negativity. Oh, we're still seeing it already. Now this ties into another important cognitive bias, what is known as loss aversion. Now, this kind of ties into the positive negative thing in the following way. From the standpoint of pure rationality, in which people were perfectly objective, what people should do is they should weigh gains and losses equally. So, to oversimplify things, kind of like the ideal economic person, who obviously doesn't exist, or kind of the ideal gambler or risk taker, by the math, what people should do is just consider what's my gain, what's my loss, what's the probability. Our good dead friend Blaise Pascal, he's super dead, but he's famous for coming up with this thing called Pascal's wager. And the gist of it is this. Pascal says, you can't know whether God exists or not. No way to know. But you gotta bet one way or another. You gotta put your money on the table, so to speak. And Pascal says, the way you do it is math. And he says, if you bet for God and get it right, you get heaven, infinite gain. You bet against God and get it wrong, you get hell, infinite loss. So based on the numbers, so to speak, you should bet for God. And Pascal was also known for developing probability theory. What is a smart way to bet? And his view was essentially, again, you take what you gain, what you can lose, and go by the odds. It's pure math. Now, economists typically kind of went with that model, the idea that people value gain and loss like equally. But it turns out that people, not all people, most people, are much more loss averse. That is, they'd rather hold on to a little than risk a little to get a lot. Now, it's not true of everybody. Obviously, there are people who are gamblers and risk takers, but psychologically, most people are loss averse. They value what they have more than what they could get. Now, on one hand, of course, that can be a good strategy, because if what you've got is enough to keep you alive, not risking it means you stay alive and you have a family, you have descendants, evolutionary theory. So, not necessarily a stupid strategy. But psychologically, it can affect us in many ways. I'll give a concrete example. We can take an example in politics. Now, suppose you have a proposal that will give more, say, to everybody, make things more equal. But if things are more equal in those ways, some people will lose some of their privilege or status. They'll lose some. Now, on the face of it, making things better for everybody should be the rational choice, because everyone's gaining. But if some people believe they're going to lose their privilege or status, even if they're going to get a lot, they will often not be willing to do that, because they see losing what they've got as outweighing getting more. And so one thing that occurs in politics, which you've all seen, is trying to appeal to people's fear. So to counter things that are going to give everyone more, to focus on people saying, well, you lose this. You lose your special privilege or status, even if everyone gains, and people will be inclined not to do that. So people are often willing to not gain as long as they don't lose something they've already got, which can be terrible for everybody. So on the side of good, how do you defend against this? Well, the idea is not to just say, well, I'm going to risk it all, gamble. The idea is to be aware of that, to say, well, psychologically, I'm probably loss averse. So whenever I'm looking at policy or an action, I'm probably thinking, how is this going to take something away from me? For example, let's take the Me Too movement. Now, as a man, might I be afraid of that? Because before Me Too, what did I enjoy? Even though I'm not a predator, I swear. What advantage did I have? Suppose I was accused of something. Who are they probably going to believe? Me, because I'm a white guy, so they're going to believe me. And so, if women are taken seriously, do I lose something as a man? Yeah, because I lose that presumption of the woman's lie. So even if I never do anything, I would still have that privilege. So if the Me Too movement remains, I lose that advantage. Similarly, the white privilege thing. As society becomes more equal, I lose that. I mean, it's not. And so I put it at a disadvantage. This is not stuff hopefully I never used probably got the advantage throughout life. And as things get more equal, I lose those. So it's a loss for me. And so what I would do psychologically is I have to say, okay, I'm losing that. That's scary. But I'd have to look at it, ethically. Is it right for me to have this special advantage? And the answer, if I believe in equality and justice, would be no. I shouldn't get a special. They shouldn't disbelieve someone just because they're a woman, or give people special privileges just because they're white. And that's an ethical view. So the way to kind of defend against it is to say, okay, I'm losing something, but is it something I should have, and is the loss really going to hurt me? Is it worth doing? And this, of course, goes into ethics and politics, because obviously if someone wants to keep that privilege, they're a predator, for example, they're not going to want to give that up. They would say, gosh, no, I don't want to give that up. And so on the side of good, we'd have to say, well, I'm losing something, but is it right for me to lose it? Also, should I be focused more on the gain or advantages? And one of the things that really, if you ever wonder, like, what holds back social change, this is a major factor. It need not be that people are all evil and terrible. There are plenty of those people. But it's that people don't like to give up what they've got, even if they're not terrible people. Because it's hard to give up an advantage. If you've got an advantage, it's hard to give that up, to say, okay, I'm going to not use that advantage anymore. And so in politics, people like to exploit that, because they know people don't like to give an advantage. And so if you scare people with that, you're going to lose your status, you're going to lose your job, like they did with in the Brent Kavanaugh nomination. One of the main tactics was, if we take women seriously, then you guys are going to be in trouble. You won't be able to get away with stuff anymore, essentially. And of course, that scared people. Now, of course, they had to bring in people who weren't predators, so they said, well, you may be falsely accused, and no one's going to believe you. They're going to believe the woman. And so the idea was to scare people with this laws. And psychologically, it'd be quite effective. So on the side of evil, here's how I use it. Find out what things people don't want to lose. And it's usually status and privilege, and also stuff. And then scare people. Tell them they're going to lose this privilege, lose this status. And they'll be more inclined to believe it, even if it's not true, even if the privilege they have is wrong. Because people, in a way, the more wrong it is, the more people want to keep it seems. So that's loss aversion. Before pressing on, anything about loss that needs more stuff. In-group bias and fundamental attribution error. Now, again, kind of a weird thing about people is, on one hand, people tend to think everyone thinks like them. But as I mentioned, people also think their own group is great, and other groups are generally terrible. Even though I guess everyone's supposed to think alike. So what's this bias? Well, one interesting feature of humans is that we form groups really easily and really quickly. And we form really strong group identity attachments on the basis of often nothing. For example, a good example would be sports teams. Some people are like insanely loyal to their sports teams, and they'll get in real angry battles over, between fans of one team and another. Now, of course, some of it's just sort of good-natured competition, but some of it can get pretty mean, ending in like rioting and destruction and stuff. But of course, do sports teams really stand for anything? For example, are the Boston Red Sox, are they the exemplar of all that is good and just in the world? And are the Yankees essentially demons in human form? Oh yeah, that's true. Well, no, sports teams stand for entertainment and money. They don't have any great principles or ideals behind them. It's not like if you back the Red Sox, you back truth and justice. And it's not like if you back, the Cowboys that you're backing, evil and corruption. They're just sports teams making money. So they literally stand for nothing. Yeah, people get incredibly identified with them to the point where they're willing to like riot and such. They've also found you can create teams incredibly simply just by handing out, team names or T-shirts, and you'll start creating rivalry and competition and trash talk just by dividing, a group of people who've never met. You split them up and make them into teams, and they'll start competing. They'll start seeing themselves as great and their team as terrible. Now, again, as to why, people who do evolutionary psychology say, well, this helps us survive, create group identity, etc., etc. But the practical upshot is, this is what people are like. That we form groups very quickly. Now, when we do this grouping, we also do two things with it. One is we start looking at our own group as better. We see our group as smarter, more moral, more deserving, more capable. We see them as the better people. And because of that, if our group is better, other groups have to be worse. So we see the other groups as bad, stupid, terrible, criminal, shifty, lazy, etc. Now, humans do this along all kinds of different lines. Obviously, people do it along, gender, ethnicity, religion, politics, any identity you can find. People will divide people into us and them. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the problem is it distorts reality. Because people think their group is better on the basis of nothing but it being their group. Another group is bad simply because it's not their group. Now, this, of course, leads to terrible consequences. Because, well, we've all seen where this goes. In some cases, it's simply just sort of people, insulting each other and saying bad things. But kind of the logical end of this is, of course, genocide. It begins with groups saying, we're better than them. And kind of that path, we've seen where that path goes. People walk into the concentration camps, the killing fields, etc. Because the logical end again is extermination. And so that is terrible stuff. So how do we defend against in-group bias? Well, again, kind of the general defense works everywhere. Being objective, saying, okay, I'm in this group, but is my group really as good as I think? Am I good just because I'm in this group? And are there groups bad just because they're not my group? So, for example, if someone thinks as an American they're better than everyone else, a fair question would be is, well, are we simply better than everyone else about everything? And the answer obviously is no. Is everyone else terrible? Oh, no. So kind of the defense is basically trying to be objective, to say, yeah, I really, really like my group, but is this really true? Is my group better than everyone else? And are those other people truly terrible? Now, in some cases, the answer will be yeah, because there are, terrible people, but in many cases, no. Now, on the side of evil, this is super useful. What you do is create us and them, and you keep pushing the differences and firing up that, that group identity. We see it today with white nationalism and white supremacy, pushing against everyone else, and we see where that goes. But it's extremely useful. So if you want to be evil, this is kind of a basic tool in evil. You create us and them, you demonize them, and I guess angelize us. Now, kind of the problem with that strategy, among other things, is you have to keep creating other groups. And if you wipe out like the other, then you need a new other. And then eventually, I guess you kill everybody. So, bad ending. Fundamental attribution error. Here's the idea with that. One mistake people often make is that when they kind of try to put themselves in someone else's shoes, they don't really do it. What they do is kind of swap themselves in, but don't consider the other person's shoes. To be a little clear about that. This occurs when someone looks at someone else and doesn't consider that if they were in that position, they would be as limited and constrained by circumstances, etc., as that person. Which is to say, if they were that person, they would face all the same challenges and restrictions. What people often do, though, is they take themselves as they are and just say, well, if I was in that circumstance with everything I've got, then I'd be fine. But, so clearly, there's no problem. Do you have a concrete example? One of the big topics in recent years has been voter suppression, which is, or as some say, attempts to stop voter fraud. Now, one of the main tools being used, supposedly to stop voter fraud, is requiring photo ID, state or federal ID to vote. And the claim is that there's so much fraud, in-person fraud, that if we don't have this requirement, elections will be fraudulent. People will come and, as Trump claimed, will drive to the polls, vote, sneak out, put on a fake hat and a mustache, go back and vote again, just keep on voting, which has never happened. But it's actually hard to get people to vote, let alone vote lots of times. But the claim is you need that ID to stop voter fraud. Now, opponents of that say that it's hard for people to get the ID. Now, when that argument is made, what many people often do is they say, that's a stupid argument because I have no trouble getting an ID. I've got one. I've got my driver's license, I've got all these IDs. That's no problem at all for me, so how can it be a problem for them? Same with things like when they have, they close down polls, and so the nearest poll is, like 25 miles away. Or they reduce the voting hours, so it's during work. And people say, well, I have no problem, I own my business, or my boss is fine with me taking time off to vote, and I have a car so I can drive across town, that's no problem. And so people say things like, it's no problem for me to get an ID, it's no problem for me to drive across town, it's no problem for me to get off work. I mean, that's true of them, but if they assume that applies to everyone, then they're making this mistake, because they're saying, well, it's not a problem for me, so how can it be a problem for anybody, without considering that person's circumstances? Now, people often do this quite honestly, because they are thinking, well, I wouldn't have any problem there, so why should they? I don't see a problem. But of course, the problem is that, as the saying goes, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, you're looking to put their shoes on and see what it's like for them. And so, if I put myself in a situation of somebody else, I'm going to look at it from their capabilities, their resources, and not just my own. Because all I'd be saying is it's not a problem for me, but it doesn't mean it wouldn't be a problem for someone else. Maybe like if someone said, I don't see why anybody needs insulin. I don't need insulin. I haven't got diabetes, which would be a stupid thing to say, because yeah, I don't have diabetes, but that doesn't mean other people don't need it. And so when people say, it's not a problem for me, I don't see it as a problem for other people, often they're making this mistake. Now, this is not to say that you can't say, well, there really isn't a problem, but to simply say, if I was, in that situation, I'd be fine, so shouldn't apply to them, would be this mistake. Now, on the side of good, the thing to do is basically say, okay, it's not just a question of, if I was in that situation with all my resources and abilities, how would I be? The question would be, if I was in their situation with their resources and abilities, how would they be? Would it be a difficulty for them? Like, if I didn't have a car, how easy would it be for me to get across, to get 25 miles away to vote? If I couldn't get out of work, how easy would it be for me to vote? So it wouldn't be just, given my circumstances, how would it be for me, and what would be like a real switch? Now, on the side of evil, this is really useful, because one way to get people to oppose or not support things like, helping other people, things like social support, student aid, etc., is to get people in that, to tell people like, oh, would you need, welfare or unemployment? No, of course not. So no one needs it, no one should get it. And so if you know the audience is well off, of course they're not going to see themselves as needing, say, student loans or unemployment benefits, because they're not in those circumstances. So, pretty useful technique. Last thing for today, obedience to authority. Now, after World War II, and one of the things that came out of World War II was knowledge of genocide and concentration camps. And philosophers, psychologists, social scientists, they wondered how seemingly normal people, educated, normal people, could become agents of genocide. So you have people who were, say, school teachers, candy makers, carpenters, becoming, concentration camp guards, becoming Nazis. So how did normal people who were doing normal stuff, how did they become Gestapo, become, running concentration camps? Now, it's a problem we've seen occur throughout the world. For example, during the conflict in what was once Yugoslavia, I heard a story of a person they were captured, and the person torturing them on the other side was their former high school English teacher, which was just weird because they knew them as their high school English teacher, the person who taught them, in high school. That's pretty weird. And so you have these normal people who are just teachers and so forth become torturers and murderers. So how does that happen? Well, this fellow Stanley Milgram decided he was going to investigate evil. And he put forth the following hypothesis. His theory is that most people are not bad. They're not evil. Because one theory is everyone's basically horrible on the inside, and we're just waiting for our chance to be horrible. And Milgram said, that's not true. Most people are normal. So, well, non-terrible. So how did non-terrible people become terrible? Well, his theory was out of obedience to authority, that they would just go along with an authority, even if they were told to do terrible stuff. And to test this, he came up with a famous experiment, which worked like this. You would be in a psychology class, and you have to do, participate in one to get credits or to make extra money or something. And you'd go in and you'd be told, okay, there's going to be a person strapped to this chair with electrodes on them. And your goal is to teach them to memorize pairs of words. And if they get it right, you go on to the next pair. If they get it wrong, you zap them, you turn it up. You go to the next pair. If they get it wrong, you zap them, you turn it up. Now, Milgram found that the people doing the experiment, the zapping, 2/3 of them would take the zapping all the way. Even when the person being zapped was screaming to be let out of the experiment and saying, well, for God's sakes, please stop. And they just keep on zapping. Now, when they asked them, was this wrong, everyone said they were doing wrong. So why did they do it? Well, Milgram's answer was because they simply wanted to obey. They didn't want to not obey. Now, lest you think that Milgram was a psychopath, the person getting supposedly zapped was faking. The person doing the supposed zapping didn't know, but no one has actually heard in the course of the experiment. Now, there have been critics of Milgram's experiment, but it does raise an interesting point, that if he's right, people have a cognitive bias towards not rebellion, but towards obedience. We're simply going along. Now, in some cases that can be good, because if we're doing something good and we go along, that's good. But of course, people often, as we saw with the Holocaust and less extreme bad things, we see that people just go along. So the defense is basically a moral one, to ask yourself the classic moral question: when my conscience goes against the dictates of authority, what should I do? And different people, of course, give different moral answers. Someone like Thoreau, for example, would say, don't go along. So next time we'll pick up with more stuff. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you on the Thursday.